The dopamine trap. Why the reward never quite lands. You feel a small dip, bored, flat, a little tired. And before you've really decided anything, your hand has already reached for the phone. Or the snack drawer. Or the add to cart button. Last episode was about sugar at 4 p.m., but sugar was just one door into a much bigger room. In this episode, you'll understand why that little lift keeps fading faster than it arrives, and why that's not a discipline problem at all. You're listening to Your Space Today, the podcast where we decode fatigue, stress, and burnout so you can rise again. Every Tuesday, we explore the hidden connections between your habits, your health, and your happiness, giving you the tools to take back your energy and your life. Sophie is 45. She runs HR for a mid-sized logistics company, which means her days are made of other people's problems. Disputes, performance reviews, a crisis dressed up as an email marked "quick question." Between meetings, she checks her phone without quite deciding to. Mid-afternoon, she's at the office kitchen, not really hungry, looking for something anyway. By 9 p.m., she's on the sofa, laptop closed, and she opens a show, tells herself 1 episode, watches 3. Some nights, it's a show. Some nights, it's 20 minutes on a shopping app, not really looking for anything, just looking. None of this looks like a problem from the outside. Sophie isn't maxing out cards or missing deadlines. She just has a lot of small habits that show up exactly when the day has taken more than it gave back. She assumes this is just who she is. Someone who unwinds by browsing, snacking, scrolling. It isn't a personality trait. It's the same mechanism from last episode's sugar craving, just showing up through half a dozen different doors. Here's what's easy to miss about all of it. The good part isn't really in the having. It's not the biscuit, the show, the item in the cart. Decades of research on the brain's reward system point to something a little counterintuitive. The dopamine surge is usually strongest in the moments before the reward, while you're still deciding, still anticipating, still mid-scroll. The moment you get the thing is almost an afterthought by comparison. The wanting is doing most of the work. The having is just where the wanting runs out. This is worth sitting with because it reframes dopamine itself. It's closer to an anticipation chemical than a pure pleasure one. The brain's way of saying, maybe this next thing will feel good, rather than the simple pleasure chemical people often call it. Once you see it that way, Sophie's evening makes a lot more sense. She's not really chasing the jumper, or the episode, or the biscuit. She's chasing the 2 minutes right before it. Hold on to that, because it explains something stranger once this pattern has been running for months. In Sophie's week, and possibly in yours. And if the reward was always in the wanting, then no amount of buying, scrolling, or snacking was ever going to fully satisfy whatever was underneath it, which changes what the actual problem is. To make sense of Sophie's day, the phone checks, the snack, the evening scroll, it helps to picture the brain's reward system as a seesaw. On one side sits pleasure. On the other, it's quieter opposite. Flatness, low mood, that gray, understimulated feeling. Something good happens. A notification, a purchase, a sweet taste, a like. Dopamine floods in, and the seesaw tips toward pleasure. But the brain doesn't like staying tipped for long. It corrects back almost immediately. And because it tends to overcorrect, it often dips slightly into the flat side before settling. That dip is the part nobody warns you about. It's why the good feeling from a small hit fades faster than it arrived, and why within minutes, you're often looking for the next one to nudge the seesaw back up. Repeat that enough times, and a second thing happens. The brain doesn't just rebalance after each hit, it starts quietly recalibrating what counts as normal in the first place. This is a well-documented pattern in addiction research. With repeated stimulation, the receptors that respond to dopamine become somewhat less sensitive, so the same input produces a smaller effect over time. It's the reward system turning its own volume down. Researchers who study this in substance addiction describe the same broad principle showing up, to varying degrees, in other repeated reward-seeking behaviors too, which is one reason an ordinary Tuesday can start to feel like it needs a little more stimulation than it used to, just to register as fine. And there are a lot of doors into that same loop. The reflexive phone check between tasks, the inbox refresh that has nothing new in it, the video that autoplays into another video, the snack that isn't about hunger, the quick browse of a sale. None of these feel like cravings in the moment. They feel like nothing, like background noise. That's what makes them so easy to miss. The urge doesn't announce itself. It just moves your hand. Here's the part that matters most. It isn't really about which door you're using. Shopping, phone checking, snacking, an extra episode, these are just different shaped keys to the same lock. Focusing on any one of them in isolation misses the point, because the underlying pull is the same everywhere it shows up. If ordinary life starts to feel duller by comparison every time you top up with a quick hit, then most advice about cutting back on your phone or just don't shop when you're tired is aiming at the wrong target. You're not failing to control one behavior. You're operating a reward system that's rewriting its own terms in the background, through whichever channel happens to be nearest. People tend to stay stuck in this for years without ever naming it, because every fix they try treats one channel, not the underlying pull. Sophie has tried, just don't open the shopping app. It works for a few days. Then a hard meeting happens or a quiet evening alone, and the pull simply finds another door. The fridge, the phone, one more episode. Not because she's weak-willed, but because the thing driving it was never actually about shopping. It was a nervous system looking for relief, using whichever tool happened to be closest. This is where it's worth widening the lens. The fuel pillar plays a role. An afternoon blood sugar crash doesn't just create a craving for something sweet, it creates a generally depleted, restless state that makes any quick hit more tempting, whatever form it takes. Movement matters because a body that sits still most of the day has fewer natural built-in sources of dopamine on offer, which raises the appeal of the digital or edible kind. Rhythm is deeply implicated too. A poorly slept night lowers the threshold for impulsive reward-seeking the next day because a tired brain is a weaker gatekeeper. And mind sits at the center of it. Stress and self-criticism keep the nervous system in a state that's constantly asking to be soothed, and a quick hit is exactly what promises fast soothing. None of these pillars causes this pattern on its own. Together, they explain why it finds so many people who look, from the outside, like they're managing everything fine. But the pillars only explain why the pull has so many doors. They don't explain why it can start to feel worse than it used to, why an ordinary Tuesday can end up needing more than it did a year ago just to register as fine. That's a separate cost, and it's the one underneath the flatness so many people describe but never quite name. Researchers studying chronic stress have traced this out directly. A reward system that's constantly asked for small hits doesn't just fail to satisfy you in the moment. Over time, it can lower your baseline capacity to feel good at rest. Ordinary, healthy things, a walk, a conversation, a quiet evening, start to register as less rewarding than they used to. That flatness, that sense of nothing feels like quite enough anymore, isn't a mood. It's a reward system running in overdraft. It's very possibly the reason Sophie's evenings have started to need a show, a snack, and a scroll just to count as rest, where a walk and a quiet evening used to be plenty on their own. If discipline was never the problem, the more useful question is different. What do you actually do with a brain that's just doing what it evolved to do? Let's talk about it step by step, because this isn't about cutting everything out at once. Right now, for Sophie, and probably for you somewhere in your day, the urge and the action happen almost simultaneously. The impulse rises, and within seconds, the phone is unlocked, the snack is in hand, the items in the cart. There's no gap. And without a gap, there's no room for the urge to be noticed, let alone questioned. The shift is to build a small gap on purpose, wherever the urge happens to show up. The experiment. The next time you notice the pull toward an unplanned purchase, a third phone check in 10 minutes, or a snack you know isn't about hunger, wait 10 minutes before acting on it. Not forever, just 10 minutes. Set a timer if it helps. During that window, do something else. Stand up, get water, step outside if you can. This works for a specific reason. The first spike of wanting is short and sharp, designed to move you to action before you think too hard about it. 10 minutes is usually enough for that initial pull to soften. What's left afterward is a clearer question. Do I want this, or am I just trying to feel less flat? That question matters beyond the moment, too. Acting on the urge immediately doesn't just chase a small hit. It answers the discomfort before you've actually looked at it. If Sophie unlocks the shopping app the second the flat feeling shows up, she never finds out whether it was boredom or the dread of tomorrow's 9 a.m. or just needing to stop and sit down for a minute. The pause doesn't only interrupt the habit, it hands the question back to her. What's this about right now? Some days the honest answer is still, I fancy a browse. But sometimes it's something a browse was never going to fix, and that's only visible once there's a gap to see it in. Some days the answer will still be yes, and that's fine. This isn't about never shopping, never scrolling, never having a treat. It's about giving your own judgment a chance to catch up with your impulses, rather than being permanently a few seconds behind them. Track it loosely if you want to. Notice how often, once the 10 minutes pass, the urge has simply lost its grip on whichever channel it showed up through that day. There's a longer arc worth naming too, because it's the reason this is worth doing repeatedly rather than once. Pull back on the artificial spikes for long enough, and the correction the brain makes each time gets smaller, which means the baseline it settles into can start to climb back up. This has been measured directly in people recovering from heavy stimulant use. Brain imaging studies on methamphetamine users found that dopamine transporter levels, which drop sharply with sustained heavy use, partially recover over roughly a year of continued abstinence, with the biggest recoveries showing up in the people who'd stayed off it longest. Nobody has run that exact scan on someone who simply cut back on phone checking or evening shopping. The direct brain evidence here comes from substance use, not everyday habits, and that's a real gap in what's known. But the underlying logic extends reasonably. Fewer artificial spikes, less pressure on the system to keep turning its own volume down. On the everyday habit side, the supporting evidence looks different. Not brain scans, but well-being data. People who take structured breaks from things like social media, gaming, or other everyday habits do tend to report some benefit within a week or two, in reviews that are upfront about how thin the research still is outside a handful of well-studied habits. Exercise breaks show the clearest, most consistent effect. Breaks from things like social media or shopping are less consistently studied, and people find them harder to stick to. But the direction of the data points the same way. So the core idea holds. Pull back on the spikes, and ordinary things do tend to feel like more again. What isn't well established is a specific timeline for that to happen with something like snacking or shopping. Worth keeping any promise on air to the shape of the effect, not a number of days. Sophie still shops sometimes in the evenings, and she still reaches for a snack now and then. But she's started noticing the 10 minutes before she used to click straight through. And more often than not, by the time they're up, she's already moved on to something else. Not because she decided to be stronger, because the gap gave the urge somewhere to land. If you recognize Sophie in yourself, the tiredness that turns into a browser tab, or a snack, or a third scroll through the same 3 apps, here's where to start. Not with restriction, but with a pause. The rest of this podcast and our site go further into the other quiet drains that feed into burnout day to day. If this gave you a useful way to think about your own evenings, passing it to someone who might need it is the best way it finds them. There's one more version of this worth understanding, because it can look like the opposite of the problem. When the healthy habit, exercise, becomes the thing chasing the hit, pushed further and further because the ordinary amount stopped registering. I break that down in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. You deserve it. Your Space Today is published every Tuesday at 6 p.m. For detailed information, disclaimers, scientific references, visit the links below this podcast. This podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with your healthcare provider regarding any health concerns